Hello. I was on YouTube looking up emotionally disturbed adults because I had G-Man on the mind. First video that popped up was this one, titled 10 Signs You Are Emotionally Immature. Is emotional immaturity a mental disorder? I made it to the second sign and thought, oh crap, I got to make a video of this. So I rewinded it back to number one. So I already know what the first two are. Everyone else, every other one's going to be a surprise to me. The first two I thought was, well, you know what I'm talking about. Obviously, this is because I've got G-Man on the mind. God damn it.
So sign number one of emotional immaturity is a lack of empathy.
Oh!
This is measured typically on conscientiousness and agreeableness. Empathy is when somebody can cognitively understand how somebody else is feeling emotionally, and they can communicate that understanding to that person. Somebody who's emotionally immature either doesn't have this ability, so they don't have the ability to empathize, period, or they don't want to use the ability. Sign number two is overreaction to life circumstances. So a tendency to move toward chaos. This can also be thought of as an external locus of control. This is when somebody doesn't believe that they have any effectiveness in their own life. They believe they are really moved about by external circumstances. So kind of just blowing in the wind. They don't have any energy or propulsion of their own. So this type of behavior, somebody's acting on their emotions. This is a type of impulsivity, typically measured on conscientiousness. Sign number three is failing to take responsibility and blaming others, usually thought of as part of conscientiousness. Somebody here is unable to differentiate their responsibilities from other people's responsibilities. So a person here may say, really, that no matter what happens, it's not their fault. So if they had a part in doing something wrong or they were totally responsible, either way, they don't have any ownership of it at all. This is really one.
Tell me this is not G-Man exactly so far. God damn.
Level of emotional immaturity. To move it to a more intense expression, we would see this failure take ownership and blaming somebody else. Much of the time when we see someone who's emotionally immature, these two actions occur one right after the other. So they fail to take responsibility and immediately look for other people that they can blame. Sign number four is always going for immediate gratification. So we see here really a failure to plan ahead. This is also a type of impulsivity, but this type is measured on neuroticism. This is the inability to resist temptation. Another effect we see associated with this is if somebody's financially irresponsible. I've seen many examples of this in my clinical experience. A common situation where we see this type of behavior is when somebody wants to buy a particular product intended for recreation, like a video game, and they would be willing to pay $50 to a friend who could sell them that game right now, when they could wait a few weeks and get it from another friend for $10. Another indication using the same example would be if the friend that the person was going to buy the game from at the last minute raised the price to $100. The emotionally immature person would just pay the $100, right? So now there's a difference between $100 and $10, right? A $90 difference doesn't matter. They want it right now, immediate gratification. Sign number five is self-centeredness. Now, one could think about self-centeredness as being an unwillingness to allow others to meet their needs at the expense of your own wants. Now, sometimes being self-centered aids in survival. Sometimes it's necessary. But that's not what I'm really talking about here. Rather, I'm talking about situations where people would really lose little or nothing by helping somebody else, but they can't see past their own desires. Whenever they're confronted with a situation, they ask themselves, how does this affect me? And they never ask themselves, how does this affect others? Sign number six is hostility. This is usually measured on neuroticism. Somebody here is quick to anger. They have a pronounced hatred of other human beings and sometimes of society in general. They personally attack other people who disagree with them. So they have an inability or unwillingness to separate a person from an opinion. If somebody disagrees with them, that person is bad, foolish, or the other person is trying to maintain some sort of agenda. So we see kind of a low trust element here as well. That would be measured on agreeableness. So number 7 is deception, and pathological lying would be a version of this. Now, this is measured to some degree on agreeableness. There's a facet called straightforwardness, but there's not a lot of overlap there. Deception is really separate of the 5-factor model for the most part. So related to deception, we also see behaviors like criminality, so involving oneself in criminal acts, or manipulation. Sometimes people lie for money. That's emotionally immature, but lying to impress others is also strongly tied to emotional immaturity. This, of course, overlaps with narcissism, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Sign number 8 is being unable to experience and understand deep feelings and needs. This is kind of similar to a lack of empathy, but here I'm really talking more about specifically being shallow. This is somewhat measured on the openness to experience trait. Sign number 9 is difficulty setting boundaries. So looking at dependence here, for example, this is when somebody's unable to end or limit relationships that are unhealthy or damaging. Now, I'm not talking about situations where somebody's trapped financially or logistically, like some people are trapped in a marriage with somebody else who's destructive. But rather, this is talking about when people have a clear way out of the destructive relationship and they fail to take action due to feelings of dependence. Sign number 10 is the individual has no room for growth. So they figured everything out. They know everything. They have every ability and skill. In a sense, this is like being cynical. Now, a person like this can still appreciate the fact that new information could come their way that they could use to benefit themselves. But in terms of learning something like a new ability, learning something about society or life or the meaning of life or any of that, this individual has it all figured out. So again, there's really no room for personal development. Only the addition of information that can be helpful to them. So those are the 10 signs. What about the other question? Is emotional immaturity a mental disorder? Well, it really depends on where you look. In the ICD, which is one classification manual for, see that there's a category called other specific personality disorders, and one of those types is the immature type. Not emotionally immature, but I think they're pretty similar. In the DSM, though, we have a different story, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which only looks at mental disorders. We see here there's no such thing as emotional immaturity personality disorder. Clearly, many of the characteristics of emotional immaturity align with certain features of narcissistic, antisocial, borderline, and histrionic personality disorders. These 4 personality disorders make up the cluster B personality disorders, the dramatic erratic cluster. But those are considered fairly extreme manifestations of personality traits, like the personality disorders usually indicate extreme levels on the 5-factor model. Now, emotional immaturity does rise to that level sometimes, in which case a person may be diagnosed with one or more of those personality disorders. But much of the time it's thought of as subclinical. So it can be somewhat distressing, but it's not really going to be the focus of treatment. Somebody doesn't necessarily need to see a mental health counselor just because the individual is a little emotionally immature. In this way, emotional immaturity has a closer relationship to the dark triad traits: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. The dark triad traits are considered subclinical, and we see quite a bit of overlap between these traits and emotional immaturity, although the overlap is certainly not perfect. For example, emotional immaturity is associated with being overly dependent on others. I talked about that before. That's not part of the dark triad traits. I know whenever I talk about topics like emotional immaturity, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They always generate really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of emotional immaturity to be interesting.
It was. Wow. Wow. Okay, so G-Man, you got 2 choices. You've either got a mental disorder or you are a self-centered asshole. Which one is it, G-Man, so that I can act accordingly? If it's a mental disorder, I have to be kind of nice because, you have to be nice to those people. If you're a self-centered asshole, well then. So pick one, G-Man. Bye-bye.